Good morning. Happy Friday. We're gonna jump right in. That was a great intro for my talk, and we're gonna talk a lot about community network automation that started 10 plus years ago. Look at where we are today, and really kind of get a glimpse of where we think we might be going in the future. My background is very much, I think, like a lot of folks in the room. Really sort of like two careers in one at this point. The first part of my career was spent really doing that traditional networking, routing, switching, or some might say firewalling, right, on Wednesday. All these technologies of designing networks, got a lot of certs along the way as well. And 2011, 12, the open flow days I'll mention in a little bit as well. It really sort of got me hooked on the future of what could be with APIs, network automation and workflows. And later on, I went to start Network to Code. I've been fortunate enough to be part of a few books, and now very much integrated to the Nordbot project. And I will say, seeing Wednesday as somebody here 8 months in the industry, and now feeling like the older guy, I'll say. Some of the folks that I've known for years, it's great to see them, and I've noticed that many of us are losing our hair and going gray quite fast. So pretty cool. In preparing for this, I went back to look at some of my prior talks, and one of the first ones, or one of the first public ones that I came across was for Interop in New York. And Interop hasn't been around for a while, even further in New York. And this talk actually highlights a lot of what we see now with NetMiko, even Ansible. There was some custom modules built for this session around doing LLDP, sort of like automated verification, inspired by, at the time, Cumulus with PTMD. I think Dinesh was part of that team, right, years ago, and that was sort of like the initial motivation for a lot of my thinking here. And looking back at this 10 plus years ago to now, I know we can still do better. And a little story. A few months ago, I was out in California, Silicon Valley, visiting a customer. We were at a data center, a colo, and we were driving back to the office, and the one guy said, "Hey, we could take my car." We got into his car, and yes, it was a Tesla. And I had never been in a self-driving car. It came up. I was in the back seat. Next thing you know, there's some buttons being pressed. I don't know. All that went down in the front. But next thing you know, we're sort of the steering wheel's taking over. We're on the highway, changing lanes, getting off the highway, parking the car, and my mind was blown. All I could think about actually at the time was network automation. It's like there's a lot more we could be doing. You could argue, we have distributed systems. Things are harder, right? You're sort of in this car. And I've given talks over the years of like it's really important to kind of get the small things right. Maybe self-parking right first, then go forward from there. And then in the conversation, more and more came up of why this person ended up going with a Tesla. And it turned out, I would say, even Wednesday's word of a trigger event of sort of like that motivating factor, it turned out that he almost hit somebody a few months prior. And it was sort of like this idea of having concern and safety, saying, hey, like to get a Tesla that has this FSD functionality, you're still supervising the car. There's cameras on you. You have to be looking forward, and you're ensuring that you're not on your phone, things like that. So it was the trigger, right, really for safety. And I think about a lot of the discussion today, I always try to like bifurcate to someone's personal journey, and then how it maps back to their employer or corporate network, and saying the triggers for us, there might be those that are more innovative, have to be on the cutting edge all the time, like that could be the trigger, or could be, there's fear, things are changing, so fear to be able to learn to stay relevant. And the same is true, right, in organizations. There might be innovative cultures to be able to stay competitive and have that advantage. Flip side is true too. If you're in a financial or a telco, right? There's there's a circuit outage or a network outage, that could be millions of dollars. And is there more fear doing it manually or more fear with automation, right? So, I think with all this being said, we come back to this question, like what would have to be true for more network automation as we think about some of those triggers. And a lot of what I've talked about in the past couple of years is sort of trying to boil it down to three things. Talk a lot about culture, skills, and data. The idea of culture, I've seen so many organizations, really struggle with culture, and it's not easy, but I would say the ones who get it right kind of have that buy-in from engineer to executive to simplify it without thinking about all the layers in between, right? Have seen organizations that invest large sums of money because there's executive buy-in, and with large engineering teams, like there really isn't buy-in, so there really isn't that growth. Flip side is true too. There's a lot of engineers in this room, and there might be lots of growth and desire to do, but without changing something at a higher level, if it's time, if it's investment, if it's the encouragement, right? That is also really hard to make an impact. And even last night, over at one of the events over drinks, talking about culture, even going up and down, there's also sort of side to side, right? This isn't just a network tower, network domain initiative, right? The ones who are getting it right kind of even go a bit wider in between teams. Talking about data, I probably could skip data. I've a bit about data in this session, but there's been so much talk about data in the past couple of days. I think that's been like the biggest shifts probably in the last several years, thinking about data and source of truth and the importance to really drive successful network automation. So I'll come back to data in a little bit to save a minute or two. But at the end of the day, it's a journey. Like this looks like it's a beautiful, beautiful journey, and it is a journey. But even thinking about projects, like there needs to be milestones. There needs to be those outcomes that are delivered, and so we'll see, milestones along the way. But the reality is, I feel like this is more like it for a lot of the organizations and even people, that we've engaged with. And you could imagine everybody in this room sort of trying to get across this mountain. Maybe there's 10%, 20% really trying to guide people along the way, and maybe along the way some people stop, right? They've kind of hit their milestone. And so it's really important, I think, to remember that everyone's journey is different. It could be personally how they learn. It could be organizationally, their appetite, right, for potentially risk. And so just kind of, again, I think Chris said it good in the sense of like bringing everybody together from different backgrounds and just recognizing that it is no doubt a journey, and it doesn't happen overnight. So I have three more sections I'm going to go through. Some of it is around these early years of a lot of the inspiration and motivation, and I want to kind of give thanks and praise to a lot of the, I would say, people and things that we'll see that kind of, I feel like are the reason why we're able to be here today and continue to celebrate the growth of network automation. This is me, I guess, 20 years ago. But I got my CCNA in May of 2001, which is so long ago. Feels like yesterday. And I ended up getting an internship that started a month later. And then it wasn't a networking internship yet, but I was on the PC support team, had my PC cart kind of bopping down the hallways trying to fix PC problems. But I got back to our little office space and was always had my Cisco books out. CCNA was accomplished, thought that was great. Routing was next, went to switching, and luckily I worked for an organization where the leaders of that team called the one network guy to kind of go transfer within a few months. And then at the time, there was a lot of Nortel base stack 350s and 450s going through an upgrade to BPS 2000 switches. And then we had, I think, XLR 1100s going to Passport 8000 series switches back then. really loved sort of learning about those types of migrations. Became really good friends with some of the folks on the global team who was doing that at other campuses, and they also had responsibility of the WAN, right? A lot of the Cisco routers at the time going from, I think, Frame to MPLS. And this team had much more scale. And thinking about triggers and trigger words, and the one for me back then was always the word template. And I told the story a little bit. Whenever I would hear the word template, I'd always try to be sly and saying, can I see that template? And I would always say, can you email it to me? Like, I really wanted access to this template that they were using to build out newer locations and sites and so forth. And it was always a Word document. And somebody said it I think on Wednesday, it was one of these operating procedure documents that was 10 pages to 50 pages or more, large enterprise, a lot of campuses, .1 to .9 reserved for network devices and gateways, and 10 through 249 for users, and 250 and above we had at the time for printers. And so it was like, thinking about this, like it was crazy to think there was no automation that was happening. And so, fast forwarding a little bit, I always feel like that word template was a trigger for me, knowing deep down there was a better way, and no one was talking about it. And I'll blame my Google at the time. Maybe my Googling wasn't good enough to find some of the Perl projects out there in the libraries to be able to get started with. But nobody was talking about it. At the time, we were talking with Checkpoint, Cisco, Nortel, NetScreen. At the time, NetScreen had NSM, NetScreen Security Manager, which was really a great product, right? But really, meant for like a controller these days. No discussions around APIs. And the reality is, we were busy getting certified, right? And I wouldn't change that for the world. I think there is sort of some of the rhetoric out there that we could blame large dominant vendors or one vendor specifically if it's around Cisco, of like why we have some of the problems that we have. I look at it differently. I'm actually really thankful, right? I'm thankful for the last 25 years of CLI networking. I'll say it made my career. Got me great jobs, met a lot of great people in that process of getting certifications along the way. And in fact, now that we can recognize that problem, it's actually allowing us to reinvent ourselves again for those that want to continue and get deeper and deeper into automation. So in effect, creating the two careers or just getting deeper into software. So really thankful to be able to go through that. At the end of the day, thinking about it, I've heard a lot of discussions in the past, and I'm one of these people who didn't want to get into software really early in my career. And so those that are getting in now with more software, are we going to accept, be more accepting of those who don't want software, want to learn networking? And I think for me personally, it was part of living that pain, living that hell, to understand the problems that we were going to go set out and solve. And I would say my career 12 years later, whatever it might be. And along the way, becoming a domain network engineer. So really thankful there. Bringing it back to OpenFlow, again, that Chris mentioned, I do think for the industry, and definitely for me personally, I'll never forget the impact that I'll say Stanford and OpenFlow and other, if it's Princeton and UC Berkeley, or a lot of universities were involved here. But I'll never forget kind of getting a DM in my LinkedIn one night about a URL, clicked it, and it was the original white paper for OpenFlow. I read it and read it again, and I joke now that I was young and naive. I thought it was going to change overnight. And for those that are newer, it was about separating control plane and data plane, kind of applying, I would say, wireless architectures 12 years ago to networking. And my day job at the time was networking. And it was a lot of times Nexus, 7K, 5K, 2K. I literally thought overnight it was going to change. And enterprises and businesses take a long time to do refreshes and things like that. So nothing was going to change overnight. But there was so much money getting invested at the time in Silicon Valley, and so many startups. Like it was so exciting. Back then Twitter was amazing. All these articles came out, all these blogs came out. to really change networking. And yeah, even overlay protocols, the discussions a couple of days ago from VXLAN, Genevieve, and I'm forgetting a protocol two, all these discussions on protocols and overlays, and like there wasn't really enough around automation, APIs, and operations. So while things didn't all pan out for a lot of those companies that were getting those investments, I think it was sort of like the catalyst to rethink networking that ended up including automation, which was really awesome. This was one of the first full days of network automation that I can remember in 2014, called DevOps for networks, out in San Jose in California. Flew out there for it, was pumped, so excited. And you could see some of the sponsors, right, that we had back then. And give a shout out to this guy, Jeremy Pollard. At the time, he was a young network engineer at Box. They were going through a lot of growth. And this is on YouTube still. I would try to go find this session. It was pretty good. There's a few themes that I think are still emerging or just really catching on with where we are within the industry. One of them is around data, and it was around getting that data in a database. And when you had devices sort of boot up and do zero touch, it was going to use that data to render into a configuration and from a template to a config to be able to deploy it onto a device. The second is this middle screenshot here. Yesterday, Christian and the person before him really talked about design-driven automation. I think this was really the early stages of that. Like, we really see the codification, right, of a design when you think about getting the next ASN or getting the next IP address, simply put, or to think about all the things that you need to be able to rack and stack configure a device. How can you automatically generate that data from potentially as few data points as possible? And so really early on, and I think we're just really probably getting started on design-driven automation, or some might call it services, right? Really thinking about things on how businesses deploy services and designs over time, right? But this was a great session. Many of these talks are actually on YouTube. Definitely worth a watch. In the early years, looking at some of the companies, and there's many more companies that were around, but I'm kind of picking a few here, calling out Forward first, because Forward comes from the Stanford crew, the founders from Forward. I remember attending training, the SDN Academy training at some of the open networking summits back in the day, and just really critical to really, again, drive the industry forward, and still going at it 12 years later. Network to Code, again, turning 11 this year. Definitely do all we can to engage in the community. And Itential and Ansible are some of the names that have been around, so like 10, 11, 12 years. Yeah, I think it's because of these companies that we're still evolving and making the progress that we have, and hopefully accelerating that as we go forward. More exciting, some of the projects, right? I would say, who in here has used NetMiko? Right, I would say. I'll assume there's even more hands that aren't getting raised. Yeah, it's almost, you can't do network automation today if you probably haven't at least tried NetMiko. My entry point was Cisco 1PK, got to NetMiko and Napalm and so forth. PyJunos EZNC, or PyEZ for short, right? One of the first of its kind. NetConf, or Juniper, had a solid NetConf API that was really abstracted away by Juniper 10 years ago. Calling out Ansible. Ansible's been the de facto standard, and back then it was growing, but it was growing purely from community interest. At the time, like there was no networking focus at the time of Ansible, so it's crazy to see like the growth that they were having on networking, even without their focus, just due to open source and the community. People, right? Some of the names that we should know: Kirk Byers, NetMiko, just amazing. David Brasso from Napalm, Murcha, a lot of his work around the salt work. Jeremy Schulman on the Juniper side. And then I'll just call out, we saw him yesterday on stage, Private IP, Peter Spargata. I think putting this slide together, you're really thinking about these transformational events that helped us get to where we are, I really think, Peter leaving Arista to join Ansible was really to build out that Ansible, the networking domain that him and later his team really built out. And again, we're really thankful for that, because before that, large organizations will adopt only so much open source without vendors, right, supporting them. And that was just so key, right, to be able to expand networking within the Ansible realm. A lot of talks were on performance on Ansible, so I still think, right, given the past 10 plus years, it was just a pivotal point for the industry. And Cisco again, over here, I think just amazing work. I think some of the latest stats that I had seen, it's over 500,000 people trained from the DevNet sandboxes, the DevNet training, just continuously up-leveling some of those skills. It's really, really critical. Some of the early books, that we saw. Hands up, who's read one of these books? A good number. We'll see more books coming up. These were the first 3 that I could find. That were the first 3 on network automation from 2000, maybe 15 to 17 or so. People. We have Kirk, Eric, Yvonne, Rick, Andreas. I think some may be in the room. Who's had at least one training class from one of these guys? Maybe you don't know because of the website. Sometimes there's a disconnection from company to individual. These are 5 folks that continues to put, they're really, heart and soul into just teaching and training and blogs, free training. Yes, some is paid training. People have to make a living as well. But it's just amazing to see, right, the community have folks that continue to give back like they do. I want to give a shout out to somebody named Nick Russo. Yeah, you beat me to it. The clap first probably, I'll have to go quicker. But I remember talking to Nick years ago, trying to recruit him. He wasn't having it. He was on his mission really to grow personally, grow his brand, grow his training content, and give back to the community. So just an amazing job to see what Nick had done. And we lost Nick last year. And so just wanted to celebrate Nick. We're going to fast forward a little bit and go into the present. We're really looking at like the past 5 years and really highlighting open source projects. And if I think back, trying to narrow it down now into sort of one project that we saw this Wednesday, I think there was a poll too, just to kind of go quicker through it, is Container Lab. I think Container Lab over the past couple of years continues to grow in adoption. And the beautiful thing is, it's really helping a lot of us accelerate automation learning, but it's also networking learning too, where you can kind of look at it going from universities to 20, 30-year vets. There's use cases really to kind of engage in Container Lab and see what it can do and offer. And I'll also, there's to a project, there's usually also a face. Roman, is Roman in the room? Shout out to Roman as well. Now, if Roman was up here, I know he would say there's a team behind him. He's at Nokia. I know there's a larger team, but Roman was the face, is the face, and I know that comes with probably a lot of inbound emails and triage and escalations, and so just amazing work from to Roman, to that team over at Nokia. These are the first books that were in the first couple of years. This is 18 more. There's even more on Amazon. Right? I didn't want to kind of get too small with these pictures. And there's even more coming. More coming on network automation, more coming on the intersection of AI and networking. And again, speaking from experience, you're really not writing a book to make money, much money, a few dollars here and there. There's usually the internal intrinsic motivation, right, to share and collaborate. And so really, again, just really thankful there's more and more people in the community that want to write, want to become authors, and really amazing to share their knowledge, right, across the globe. So really great to see. Kristen Scott, we got to give, round of applause, Kristen Scott. It's 2 years, into NAF, just seeing the growth. I think the numbers that I heard, over 650 people. We're here this week, and have to continue to ask ourselves, how do we all bring one friend or maybe two friends, one who's maybe a little more junior, one a little more senior, to kind of really expand that skill sets. That Wednesday talk, I keep thinking about it. Somebody 8 months in the industry. I think we have to continue to diversify, right, the experience and the talks to be able to make sure that everyone can sort of continue to learn something and have it be not too deep and not too high level enough as well. Just an amazing growth within NAF. But with where we are within the industry, I still think there's a lot of growth. I call them power tools. Wednesday we can call them quick wins, but typically we're solving problems. Today's Friday. There might be a change somebody has tonight or tomorrow night or Sunday. Maybe you're preparing for a change next week or next month. You might have taken one of Kirk's Python classes and you're saying, hey, I just learned this and I want to go apply this and make this change, do this backup, or go rotate community strings or SNMP contacts across 10 devices or 100 devices. This is so important to be able to start to think about with what you learn, how it can be applied. And the most common thing right now is still with these power tools. In the US, I'm a Shark Tank guy, and I think I used Shark Tank casts in Europe, and it didn't go over too well. So I got the British version here of the sharks. And the reason is I think outcomes are what get budget and investment, right? And I think my viewpoint has changed really in the past 3 years or so, I would say, because I would usually attend events or sit through talks, and we would see all these like custom built things and saying, well, there's actually other projects that already exist. Why wasn't that used? We've got to recognize everyone's journey is different, right? Everyone's personal journey is different. The appetite, even organizations, maybe we can't use more than the Python standard library. There's just crazy requirements that that exist out there. And so now I think we have to appreciate more like solving those problems, solving those outcomes are the most important to recognize, because it is showing what's important for a given organization or for that individual who's performing those changes. Now, I will say at a certain time, at a certain scale, there is that shift in thinking. I could have included Terraform up here too, but by and large, the de facto are sort of like terminal executed Python scripts, Ansible playbooks, and so forth. And typically, it is that person who's building them that's running them as a power tool or a script, whatever you want to call it. If we shift over to the right a little bit, it's the evolution of like thinking about self-service, right? A little bit. Hey, we have this, it's working, but maybe how do we harden it? How do we expose it to a larger audience? And thinking about some of these maybe advanced workflows, how do we deconstruct them, decompose them into reusable components? It's kind of the evolution of where we go on that journey from power tools or the insertion point, but then really expanding that as we go forward. And best seen here, really the reality is it really is about going from a team of one who's building and executing their automation to thinking about how is that distributed, disseminated to maybe their team initially, their organization, and maybe even exposed as higher level services, right, as we think about services and designs, right, as we heard about yesterday. So network source of truth or data, really, it was just amazing to see, and I feel like the vast majority of talks this week mentioned data or source of truth and all the discussions. And we closed last night hearing about the importance of design-driven network automation, which is really rooted in data, right? Taking one of those 50 or 100-page network design documents, operating procedures, kind of codifying that and being able to get the next piece of data required to build a configuration. And I think, again, more and more people and companies are seeing the importance of getting that data laid down. And I would say my journey around data, it did start around NetBox, 2017, in that time frame. And we did have a good partnership at Network to Code for 18, 24 months. As Steiny put it, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, we went through a little breakup, a little divorce, if you will. And later came Autobot. And it's great having that choice. There was a different vision, right? Different strategy, which really led to that fork that Chris mentioned. And then NetBox Labs came about, really took on NetBox, which is, again, amazing to see the growth there as well. And the new kid on the block, which is Damien and team over at OpsMill and InfraHub, right? So we see the growth here. And so now we have NetBox, and Autobot, InfraHub, giving us choice, right? Allowing us to make the decisions that are right for our businesses, for the problems that we're trying to solve. And I will say with all of this, competition makes us all better. I feel like not just the 3 companies, right, that are sponsoring these projects, but there's a lot of companies up there on the expo floor. And what fun would it be if there was no competition, right? I think it makes it a lot more fun to innovate, stay competitive, and really get a lot of the requirements and feedback, right, from those in the room to really help shape the roadmaps. Coming back to NAF and vocabulary, I think this is still when we look at the past couple of years, still improving, right, as we go forward. And I said at NANOG, a few months ago about software-defined networking, and I always remember Jay Shree from Arista, getting asked years later what SDN meant, and I think her response was, "Still don't know." And so, I think to be mindful of all of the blogs and media articles around definitions from intent-based networking to SDN, and now it seems like source of truth is one of those topics. And I generally like to say, hey, look, if you genuinely know like the intent of what's being said, no pun intended, then we know sort of like the intent of that is intended state of source of truth. But there are interpretations of it, so it is good to kind of understand background and context, right, and level set. As many have said, we can't give talks right now without mention, at least a little bit of mention of AI. I do think the time is now, right, to kind of dive in and explore. A year and a half, 2 years ago, it was like Gen AI was, that phrase was everywhere. And I feel like this year or last year kind of really pivoted to agentic in the last 6 to 9 months. MCPs coming out, A2A protocols. There's a lot to really digest. And I think the most important thing really is to kind of be comfortable with that change. And it does seem like it's going fast, but I would say what we are seeing is the art of the possible. So I think a lot about network automation 10 years ago. The important piece here is to read, experiment, and learn. I don't think we have necessarily the frameworks or the products or the tool chains yet that are going to kind of give us that jump off point for mass adoption. Right? I think we're going to continue to see the growth, and I think just getting started. But I do believe when these tools get the adoption, it's going to be at a faster rate than we saw within network automation. On the community front, again, thinking about people here, there's one guy I can think of, John Cappo. I'm sure everyone's seen either Twitter, LinkedIn, or social. I think he's at a conference in the US from seeing his LinkedIn this week. But again, this guy too, his heart and soul goes into AI. And again, it's just really getting exposed to the art of the possible, just to start to think about what is possible in your domain every day and start getting those ideas. And then over time, start to look at how those might get implemented, right, in a given environment. So fast forward a little bit, now going into the future, what's in this crystal ball for network automation and so forth going forward. I have a few things here, and a lot of it, again, we don't know, it's the future. But I would say some obvious things that we're seeing already. I do think open source is going to continue to play a pivotal role. I think this started probably 11, 12 years ago, continues to grow, but we haven't seen yet like the intersection, right, of AI and open source for networking. And examples that I would give are things like NetMiko and PowerMiko. All right, PowerMiko's been around for a long time, but NetMiko really made that consumable for networks. I think we should expect to see either current projects, right, infuse AI with them, or we're going to see some of these maybe wrappers and things like that to really allow us to take more advantage of AI marketplaces. Again, open source, easier to get access to, freemium models, self-service. Right? I still think one of the common trends, even in a smaller growing company, right? How to, as a small group trying to even build software for the world and talking to engineers, like engineers and teams don't want to go through 3 or 4 or 5 sales meetings, right, to get software. So it's something, the evolution of where technology is and where cultural shifts are is seeing the evolution in sort of, marketplaces and open source. And as I already alluded to, enterprise AI, I think it's going to take time. And I have to say that because I really did think 10 years ago, things were going to change overnight. And so I'm going to be a little more cautious saying enterprise AI is going to take some time, but when it does, it'll be at that faster pace. Last bullet here is a little more controversial. Right? I've been a part of so many discussions over the years of, should network engineers learn Python, learn to program? Are they going to be defunct in the future? And again, if you're a domain expert, you're going to be solid. If you're in this room, I think you're years ahead of the curve. But I do think there is that continued growth of kind of having the haves versus the have-nots. And it's not to necessarily be controversial, but I do think when we think about these baseline skills in the next generation or new network engineer, when we think about Linux and Git, a little bit of Python, making an API call. This is where even if you're using no open source and just buying a tool, there's APIs. How do you test to make an API call? Can you launch Postman, make an API call? Can we open an IDE, import request, make an API call? So it's not to say like there's a full-on deep pivot in skills, but the baseline skills have to get there. And because I do think AI is going to have a profound impact even with how we learn. And if there isn't interest to continue to learn, that skills gap is going to continue to grow. Community growth from companies, projects, people, and books. We have such a large group here, right? You have the US-based NAFs. So my question is, what's the next project? Who wants to write the next book? Who has something to share? I think everyone in here, really has something to share. And I'd love to help. Ask the person next to you if they want to contribute to a book, to a project. Heck, invite, again, more people to the next NAF events. Maybe it's the next company, right? Maybe it's a networking event here that people are going to brainstorm on the next big thing. We never know, but the challenge is there to see what we need, right, to continue to grow the community and really the industry. Can't really have a talk today not mentioning AI. And I don't think anybody mentioned vibe coding this week. So, let's talk a little bit about vibe coding. We have yay or nay, just to kind of save a minute. I'm a yay asterisk, kind of guy. And in prep for this, in discussions, it was like, well, you've got to have like these 5 caveats, these 10 caveats of when it's okay, when it's not. And we have to be logical, right, about the application of new technology. But when I think about the ability to build a power tool or a prototype, an MVP, to me it just seems like it makes sense, right, to be able to experiment and learn, even coupling it with like general LLMs. And if there's people or teams struggling to get buy-in, and let's just say the manager is a former security guy or an application guy, let's go to an LLM. Hey, I have a tough manager. This is their background. They're cost conscious, and here's our problems. Our past 3 months, we've had a lot of issues about X, Y, and Z. Give me 10 ideas to create a power tool for network automation that I could code in less than a week. Can you help me build that? Right? Can you help me build that power tool? Mr. Mrs. AI system? And so like it's really important to kind of, to me, the general sentiment is to be open, right, to these newer ideas and newer technologies. But when we see the growth of AI, this sort of looks like potential pipeline. I think we're going to see some pipelines like this that get created around. You have an objective. Let's say it was that power tool. We have AI creating automation, creating the test suite, the test harness for the automation, having AI execute the automation, and then again with the promise of agentic. What if we swap out a network device type, go from vendor A to vendor B? Right? We should see issues, and we should see that code adapt. Right? Imagine this in a continuous life cycle and a continuous pipeline. And by the way, I started that with saying the objective. Just imagine if we had a syslog or a AAA server that was logging all of the commands over the past N years. And it knew the commands being run, who was running them, when they were running them, had context to the business, retail, financial, telco, and to create that initial plan of these are the recommendations. We're going to go start to build that automatically, right, with the promise of AI. So I will say, AI for me is this undeniable force multiplier. Again, Peter said it yesterday. I don't think any of us really know what's going to happen in 12 months, 24 months. But it's evident when we look at the last 2 years, things are changing fast, and we got to be open to that. So this is a picture I used in a presentation 12 years ago. There's a lot of discussion back then around network automation and coding in Python, and pick your favorite tool or language is like giving a loaded gun to a monkey. I remember talking to a network manager actually, and we were talking about it, and he said, I'm never going to give a programmer access to my network. And I said, that would be your employee. Like, that would literally be, he would be on your team reporting to you, and he'd be working with 3, 4, 5 network engineers. Right? It's about that collective collaboration that needs to happen to really uncover, right, new ideas and new ways to solve problems. And so I think we're gonna hear a lot of that with AI. And AI, things might be more exponential, but we still have to apply logic and be safe. Right? It's not just going to hire a Python programmer that doesn't know networking to insert them into a network team. And therefore, the same is true for AI. So I think about it, what would have to be true? Because like there's always sort of like the feedback, right, around some reasons why we can't do it. So like my always question is, well, what would have to be true for you or for your environment to trust automation, and nowadays for AI? And I think if we answer this, I really do believe that the rest is details. But if we can get on paper why it doesn't work for us, if we can kind of start to do that research, and maybe use some AI to help overcome some of those hurdles. These are some words that I live by personally. First time probably verbalizing them professionally. I really think, given where we are and looking at the next 10 years, it begins with a dream. We have to dream like there is a better way, right? A better way to operate personally, a better way to automate a network. And once we dream that, we got to believe we can go do it. Once we have that belief, then it's the fun part. We got to go do it and make it happen. Thank you.
Hi, Jason.
We have time for probably 2 questions.
Test. It's coming on. Yep, we're good. So, Bart Dorland here. Thank you for your presentation. Awesome. You mentioned that competition makes us better, right? That's true, but is it true? So, isn't the competition these days also holding us back because of, I actually wrote it down because I also forget it, right? Because of given that NAF is all about why haven't we seen global adoption of automation yet, right? And isn't it true that the competition nowadays and business and egos and historic information is actually holding us back? Let's say big vendors trying to release or not able to release a version of their firmware as a Docker, right, to play with it. And not pointing at anybody specifically, but isn't that part actually holding us back in a way? You later.
Damien's next, so Damien can give his take maybe when he shows up. But yeah, look, I think I understand sort of maybe the sentiment of the more options there are, right? The more the longer it might take because you got to figure out that path. I would say in my day-to-day, when we think about again engaging with users or customers, really I think like the number one I would say competitor that's out there to a lot of the companies, to be honest, I think it's like it is DIY, right? So I think it might not even be the use of something that is open source or commercial. And I was saying this last night to somebody, over the past couple of years, there's a lot of analogies from the DevOps community into networking. And that was a little bit of I'll say before my time, but I was never in really deep in the system space. But what I can observe in the discussions that I've been a part of is a lot of the evolution. It was Puppet and Chef. Ansible came along with a little bit of salt. I feel like by and large, like there was a lot of rallying around those, and it wasn't around necessarily custom building frameworks that were going to manage hundreds to thousands of servers. I still think right now in the networking space, there's probably more custom sources of truth than there are users of those three that are on there as an example. Same is true for automation engines and so forth. Workflow orchestrators, we heard, I feel like if we're using something that's open source or a product, I feel like that helps us go forward. But if we feel strongly about a technology, we could definitely go from DIY to open sourcing it. But I think trying to rally together is definitely needed. But I feel like over time to really get there, the level of DIYing of maybe using open source plus extending it versus homegrown custom, I feel like that probably is a shift that we're going to need to see for wider scale adoption of network automation.
Hey, Jason. Nice talk, historically, much more accurate than some of the other historical talks that I've heard. I wanted to point out a couple of things. The first thing I want to point out is you talked a lot about the people who were pushing automation, the tools that were there like PyATS, not PyATS, what is that, PyNTC, some other stuff. We were at Cumulus saying you need none of that. We could do all of the things that people were doing today back then. Mm-hmm. But Cumulus is nowhere today. Mm-hmm. And part of the point I'm trying to make with that, I think as a community, we need to understand the power of abstraction and an idea that's a little too far for people to grasp. If I go back in time and people ask me, Dinesh, what would you change about Cumulus? I think the thing that Cumulus did that did not get it where it needed to be was the fact that as an abstraction, it was way too advanced for people to grasp it.
Agreed.
We did not need NetMiko. We did not need Paramiko. We did not need PyNTC. We did not need sources of truth. We did all those things and more. Some of those talks that you talked about were actually using Cumulus. The pioneers were using Cumulus to do that. But the trouble was it was an idea that was too far ahead. I'm not saying this to pat my back or make a point about a missed historical lesson, but to say that it's important every time to remember two things. What words are you using to describe the problem? You said certification was great for careers, but certification is what is giving us all here whiplash problems with respect to why network automation is where it is. Because it held us back with abstractions. It tied what is a concept, BGP, with how do I configure it. And the two were so tied that we couldn't disengage from them. That, I fear, is the danger. SDN was a similar thing. What it did is, while thanking Stanford, there's a section in the paper that I wrote about in my book which said, there are two parts that they had. One was to say, let's ask the vendors to get us an API. And they said, nobody will ever do that. What we will do, since we are a research and we can dream, is go and deal with changing everything, including data separation of data and control plane, which, by the way, was already done. BGP and the packet forwarding was different. So the power of abstraction is important. And to this community, I will stress again, please, please, please think about it. And to the gentleman who talked about competition, I think it's important to understand what the point you're making is important. What we are all dealing with a lot now is analysis paralysis. And the power of abstraction and the danger of, what's the word for it? Oh, God, that you're eloquent. When you look at AI, what AI is eloquent. What an SDN controller was eloquent. And if you are not careful about the abstractions and separate it out, and that's some of the work that Christian, Wim, myself, Claudia, Ryan are all trying to do, is separate that out. If you're not aware of that, you will end up in the same spot. And again, back to NAF 25, we shouldn't be asking why is network automation still not adopted? Because we got waylaid by SDN, we got waylaid by DIYs, we got waylaid by AI.
Yeah.
So I think to think about abstraction and understand the questions and how it applies to us is far more important today than it ever was. And not being aware of it is really important, because forgetting that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And we are going to be in a rhyming lesson.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with a little joke. You can see, I think the more grades we get, the more opinions that we have as we grow. One only comment to kind of pick on one thing you said in the early on is a cumulus. And again, you were there, I wasn't. But I would say being on the outside there, I would say like the one thing that I think was wrong there is like trying to change the OS and the operational model to Ansible at the same time. Then there came a CLI. And I think the abstraction was realized there that it needed a CLI to get network engineers adopting, then the DevOps tools. Doing both at once, it was a big lift. I think we could probably agree to disagree that sources of truth aren't required for next-gen operating systems. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think the discussions that we're having are critical, right, as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.